Thank you. Thank you. Okay, a very warm welcome to you all on this special occasion. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Stefan Gosepath. I'm a professor of philosophy here at the Freie Universität Berlin and also a PI, principal investigator of the cluster Scripts, which is hosting this event tonight. I should like to extend a special welcome to our guest speaker, of course, Professor Michael Sandel. Thank you. Thank you. We are delighted and very honored to be able to welcome this distinguished political philosopher here today. Michael actually was here already 2013, so 10 years ago, in this next lecture room, if I remember correctly, and gave a lecture on what money can't buy, the moral limits of markets. It's a great pleasure, Michael, to have you here with us this evening again. Michael Sandel is an eminent American political philosopher. I guess you know that, otherwise you wouldn't be here. A graduate of Brandeis University, Sandel received his doctorate from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Since 1980, he has been teaching political philosophy at Harvard University. He won numerous prizes, held many prestigious lectures, has been a visitor to a whole number of renowned institutions. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Council of Foreign Relations. And Sandel's work has been translated into 23 languages. But these dry academic facts leave out the most important bit. Michael Sandel can, without exaggeration, be said to be one of the most well-known public contemporary political philosophers. The BBC has even called Michael Sandel a philosopher with the global profile of a rock star. Why is this? There are doubtless many reasons. I shall mention those that I consider to be the most obvious. All of them have to do with the impressive way in which Michael Sandel manages to leave behind the narrow boundaries of his discipline and instead engages in public discourse with people. First of all, then, Sandel is an exceptionally gifted teacher. His undergraduate course, Justice, has enrolled over 15,000 students and is the first Harvard course to be made freely available online and on TV. There's also an accompanying book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, 2009, and in German with Ullstein, 2013. And I just learned that Fischer bought all the Ullstein rights, so these things are coming out with Fischer as well. And the source book of readings, Justice, a Reader, from 2007. Sandel was recognized by the American Political Science Association in 2008 for a career of excellence in teaching, and that's well deserved. Secondly, his work is not only addressed to those inside the university and the academy, but is pitched at a much wider audience. Michael Sandel challenges ordinary people to apply critical thinking to issues people usually rely on instinct to resolve. In the way he does that, he revives an old philosophical tradition. As Socrates stood in the agora and asked his fellow citizens about the right, the good, and the beautiful, so does Michael Sandel engage in argumentative dialogue with his audience around the world. Thanks to the internet, he reaches millions all over the world. Michael Sandel does not preach, but poses questions to the audience, asks for counterpositions and possible arguments for that. By engaging with them, he forces the audience to reflect the issues. His aim is to show that we can not only quarrel, but reason together with arguments in a solid way, both about questions of practical everyday life and about philosophical problems like justice. Thirdly, in order to engage in public discourse in this way, one should have something to say. And Michael Sandel definitely has something to say. He's indeed famous for holding and defending certain particular views in philosophy. He develops a certain version of communitarianism in his first book, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, came out in 1982, and the second version in 1998. That book already made him famous, among other things for his critique of Rawls' conception of persons, as Michael Sandel puts it, unencumbered selves. In the book, The Case Against Perfection, Ethics in the Age of Genetic Engineering, 2007, and in Berlin University Press 2008, he explores moral quandaries connecting with the quest to perfect ourselves and our children. He argues that the drive to enhance human nature through genetic technologies is objectionable because it represents a bid for mastery and dominion that fails to appreciate the gifted character of human powers and achievements. The book that was the source of his last lecture here at Freie had the title, or the source has the title, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, and came out in English 2012 and in German the same year, again with Ullstein. Was man für Geld nicht kaufen kann, die moralischen Grenzen des Marktes. It is a moving plea against the increasing commercialization of more or less all aspects of life. Sandel shows that there is something wrong with a world in which everything is for sale. His book, The Tyranny of Merit, What Becomes of the Common Good, in 2020, Deutsch, Vom Ende des Gemeinwohls, wie die Leistungsgesellschaft unsere Demokratie zerreißt. I actually put some of the books here on the book shelf. From Fischer, also 2020, seems to have struck a nerve, at least here in Germany. It is very often debated and quoted here. People seem to agree with his general diagnosis, but are afraid to take the necessary action. This brings me to the topic of tonight's lecture. Michael originally published Democracy's Discontent in 1996 and has recently updated it. A German translation has been published just these days, Das Unbehagen in der Demokratie, was die ungezügelten Märkte aus unserer Gesellschaft gemacht haben. And you see copies here on the table. On the occasion of this German publication, Michael Sandel is on tour in Europe and in Germany with stops in Frankfurt and Cologne. So we should thank the Fischer Verlag, whose representative is over there, and the Berlin cluster, the Contestation of the Liberal Script, in short Scripts, for making this event possible. But of course, my greatest thanks goes to you, Michael, for being here with us this evening. It is fitting that Michael's talk, The Democracy's Discontent, is being held as a distinguished cluster lecture, as the Cluster of Excellence, the Contestation of the Liberal Scripts, is a research consortium analyzing why, despite its political, economic, and social achievements, the liberal model of order has fallen into crisis, as it obviously has. Unfortunately, democracy as a form of government is under threat throughout the world, even though almost all states brazenly claim to be democracies. This is, I guess, the obvious reason, I suppose, why we all are so eager to hear what you have to say about democracy's discontent. The floor is yours. Pleasure that you are here.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Stefan, for that very generous introduction. It's great to be back at the Freie University, and I remember warmly 10 years ago, the last time we gathered here. This time, we gather at a time when democracy is in trouble. Democracy is facing hard times. And so the question I would like to discuss with you today is why this is so. Why is democracy under a shadow of doubt and challenge? And connecting this question to the project on the liberal script. I'd like to discuss, before we finish, a related question, which is, to what extent does the crisis facing democracy have something to do with a weakness or a flaw or an inadequacy in the liberal script itself, in liberal understandings of politics and economics and of freedom that we have largely taken for granted over the past 4 or 5 decades. To begin this discussion, I would like to invite you, as we did 10 years ago, to join me in a discussion. Are you willing to do that? Are you sure? It doesn't sound like you're too sure. Well, we'll see. We'll put it to the test. We'll be the judges, right? I'd like to put to you a proposal that was advanced by a political philosopher at the dawn of the democratic age, at least in what we recognize as the era of universal suffrage, in the mid-19th century. John Stuart Mill, the great liberal utilitarian philosopher, argued in favor of universal suffrage. Every citizen should have a vote. But he also wanted to make sure that in an age of universal suffrage, those who were educated, those who were well-informed, would be able to play a special role in democracy. And so he proposed that while everyone should get at least one vote, the number of votes per citizen would vary depending on how well educated people were. So, an ordinary manual laborer, John Stuart Mill suggested, should have 1 vote. A skilled worker should have 2. A supervisor or a manager or a foreman, perhaps 3. Farmers who had to engage with more complex judgments about markets and about goods and bringing their produce to sale, maybe they should get 4. Members of the professional classes, the learned professions, lawyers, doctors, they should get 5. And everyone who attended university and got a degree should get at least 6. 6 or 7, he said. He added the generous provision that for those who hadn't attended university and received a degree, but who nonetheless had informed themselves about public affairs, that they should be able to take a test, and if they passed the test and demonstrated the knowledge of a university graduate, they too should get the 6 votes or the 7 votes, the maximum number. John Stuart Mill's system for plural voting. Let's take a poll, a survey of opinion in the room. How many would be in favor of John Stuart Mill's proposal, and how many would be against? Let's first see by a show of hands, how many are in favor? How many think he had a, what? Well, women could qualify in any of those capacities, but it would still vary by education. All right, but now that we add that, do you vote in favor? Who votes in favor? I don't see anyone. Do you see any hands? How many are against? All right, so overwhelmingly, The people in this room are against. But now the more interesting question is why? What's wrong with it? Why do you object to John Stuart Mill's system of plural voting? Number of votes depends on how well educated you are. Who will begin our discussion by explaining what's wrong with it? Yes, stand up and we'll get you a microphone. And tell us your name, if you would.
My name is Sanjay Park, and
Sanjay Park?
yes.
Yes, go ahead. Tell us why.
And so the system is that the best educated people get the most number of ballots. But the thing is, like, the standard of being best educated, like, educated could mean the same thing as brainwashed, depending on how.
That's how you view education, Sanjay? Are you a student here at Freie University?
I'm an exchange student from South Korea, and
Okay.
and
Yeah.
a few years ago they had the government tried to state produce the history textbooks.
Yes.
Like
Right.
the state writes the history textbooks that are
Right.
to be taught.
Right.
Yeah, so
And you felt that was a form of indoctrination.
yes.
Yeah. And so you wouldn't want to give extra votes to students who had gone through that system.
Yes.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. So that's why you voted against plural voting.
Maybe not the only
Not the only reason. All right. But that's an important one.
Yes.
Thank you for that, Sanjay. Who else? I mean, everybody voted against. Who else has a reason to offer an objection? Yes. Here, we've got a microphone for you.
Perhaps it exists distinction between making good, just, ethical, sound decisions and getting education.
So, and what's your name?
Azret.
Azret?
Yeah, right.
So Azret, you think people with a good education are not necessarily best equipped to make sound judgments about government?
Yes, you can be a good mathematician, for example, but it doesn't mean that you can make ethically sound decisions. For example, this connection is not necessary.
You don't think that the education that you and your classmates are receiving here will equip you to make good judgments about government?
Yes, it's better, but it's not necessary decision. It's not necessary connection. It may help you, but doesn't mean that you are going to
And
make
why
such kind
not?
of-
What's missing? What do you not get in a university that would help you decide how to govern?
University helps you to get some kind of education, but it does not teach you, but it does not mean that you apply all this knowledge that you have, for example, in the ethics and political philosophy to current issues.
Aha. You may not be able, you may learn the ethical principles in university, but you may not be good at applying them in concrete situations. Thank you for that. Who else has an objection? Let's go to the back. There's someone sitting up toward the back. Stand up and tell us your name. You're also opposed to John Stuart Mill's plural voting scheme. What's your reason?
Right, I'm Killian, and at least empirically speaking, the education is derived from your parental education, right? So in that way, you create a political elite that has more power over, or more of a say in democracy than other families who do not have a good, educational background.
And so, Gillian, you worry that this system would create, stay there, keep the microphone for a moment, that this would create an elite that has a greater say in the democracy.
And that perpetuates it, yes.
And that can be perpetuated one generation to the next. And why exactly is that bad?
Because that goes against our understanding of a just society, which means that everyone should have the same say in decisions that every member of society is affected by.
Everyone should have the same say in a democratic society in decisions that affect everyone. That's, in fact, Gillian, would you say that's a fundamental principle of democracy?
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah? So the people, now I have a hunch that many of the people who objected on this grounds, that it's undemocratic. Is that right? You also, that creates an elite. Maybe even an elite that's passed down one generation to the next. All right, am I guessing right that Gillian's reason is a reason that many people had in mind? All right, now I'd like to ask a different question, since there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of disagreement on the John Stuart Mill example. Let's move from the mid-19th century to the present. Let's look at the parliaments and national legislatures of democratic societies. And let's look at the educational profile of those who serve in them. In the United States Congress, in the Senate, 100%, all of the members of the US Senate have university degrees. In fact, a very high percentage of them also have law degrees. In the House of Representatives, the so-called lower house, 95% have university degrees. Now, in the United States as a whole, most people do not have four-year university degrees. Nearly 2/3 do not. In Germany, 87% of the members of the Bundestag have university degrees, bachelor degree or higher in many cases. 87%. What percentage of the German adult population has a university degree? Around 20, depending on the age range. The estimates that I've read seem to range from about 20 to 27%. So here's the question. About 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 German citizens have university degrees, and yet they have almost all the seats in the Bundestag. Likewise in the United States. Likewise in most European democracies. The majority of the population do not have a degree, and almost none of them, or only a tiny fraction of them, are members of national parliaments. Now let me ask you your opinion about this condition. How many find this governance by those with diplomas, essentially, how many find it objectionable? Raise your hand. And how many do not find it objectionable that the well-educated are disproportionately represented? Now, there's more of a division of opinion here than there was on John Stuart Mill's proposal. But the question I would like to put to those of you who don't find the current system objectionable is this. Is there a difference in principle between John Stuart Mill's proposal, extra votes for the college-educated, and the current state of democratic representative government in our societies? Who can explain? You think there's a difference? Yes, tell us why.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a difference because in this system, people still need to convince the majority of the population to support them, even if they are already in power, and they don't automatically have the overwhelming amount of votes where they don't need to convince the people. Now, if the majority of the people don't agree with the decisions, they can still vote against it, and they still have more of a voice that way. That's just as a whole, they have more of a voice. Otherwise, it would be unequal, and they would be in power and have more votes. So it would be even more unequal.
And what's your name?
Finn. Finn.
Finn?
Yeah.
And it would be unequal. The John Stuart Mill system, that's unequal, where the well-educated get more votes. That's unequal. And this system is not unequal?
It is not perfectly balanced. That's true. But I feel like it would make it easier in the Mill system.
It would make what easier exactly?
For them to just have the overwhelming votes, because in this system they still need to convince people. The people in power, like the well-educated, even though the majority of the Bundestag is well-educated, they still need to convince the people to vote for them.
Well, let me ask you just this very simple question. Isn't it a good thing to be governed by well-educated people?
It is.
It is? Okay. Yeah. All right. Who else would like to explain the difference? Yes. Stand up.
I think that there's a fundamental difference in the right to vote a certain parliament that then executes certain things that need to be executed, and the actual way of doing the task. So if you look at the people who run the governments, or certain parts of it, they are qualified in their respective fields, and I think that is a different kind, because they have to do specific tasks that are important, and that it's important to be educated in that specific field.
They need to be experts.
Exactly.
And so it's a good, would you, what's that? Most of them are not experts in the Bundestag. You don't think so?
They're expert politicians, but not experts in their field.
They're expert, what's your name? Patricia says they may be expert at getting elected, but they're not experts in their field. And what's your name?
Simon.
Simon, what do you say?
I would agree that it's not perfect, but that there is a tendency. So the people who work in, I don't know, legislation, they have often law degrees, or the people who work in agricultural ministries, they have certain backgrounds in their specific field. It's not always the case, but there's a strict tendency that the field they are qualified in, they are the ones who make the decisions.
So generally speaking, it's good to be governed by people who are experts, who are knowledgeable.
But the people still have to be elected by people where this kind of educational barrier is not established.
But why? Suppose giving more, why wouldn't your argument, I'm sorry, your name is?
Simon.
Simon. Simon, why wouldn't, if it's good to be governed by experts, why wouldn't you want well-educated people with more influence in the first place?
I think in the basic sense of democracy, it shouldn't be important how well one is educated and how good decisions one would make, but more who is affected by these decisions. So everyone who is affected by a certain decision made by the government should have a word in it. So I think that's why people in the US are not electing the German government, even though if they might be more qualified. So it's a question of who is affected by a certain decision.
All right, thank you for that, Simon and Patricia. Now, let's hear from someone who thinks, in principle, the current practice is objectionable on the same grounds as the John Stuart Mill plural voting proposal is objectionable. Who thinks that they're morally on a par, that they're equally objectionable? Who holds that view? And can you tell us why? Yeah, go ahead.
Equally, I'm not sure, but they're both objectionable. Primarily because if you only focus on the parliament members who are very well educated, it tends to lead to groupthink. It tends to lead to misunderstanding of a big part of the population. And long-term, it might lead to certain logic, policy proposals that exclude a big chunk of the population.
Even if the people making the decisions are experts?
Expertise is a questionable term. I think here one needs to take into account general value judgments that often get smeared by the alternative incentives that these policymakers have.
Right.
At the end of the day, they're human.
Do you think well-educated people are better at, generally speaking, more reliable at making good value judgments?
In certain areas, but often we know that the decisions made by a lot of educated people in the last 70 years, if we want to take some empirical example,
Right.
has led to topics that we're talking about today. So, based
What
on
do people, what's your name?
Alexander.
Alexander raises an interesting question. I'd like to put it to the whole group. Do people think that well-educated people, generally speaking, make better value judgments in politics than less well-educated people? How many think, yes, on the whole, well-educated people make better value judgments about governing? And how many say no? How many don't think so? Thanks for that, Alexander. I want to, right over here, you had a view, yes.
Hi, I do have a completely different problem with the whole thing from Mill and also the second one where I think that they're objectionable. And that's the term on who is to be educated, like who is called educated and who not. By defining who's educated or not, there will need to be one certain person or an institution to set like boundaries, who's called educated, who's going to have 5 votes, 4 votes, 3 votes, who's going to be eligible to be a politician or whatever. Right. And I think that's a huge problem because by that you have one certain person or institution on top of all of that reigning, like somehow.
And so how did you vote? Are they both objectionable, both the current practice and the plural voting?
So for me, what would not be objectionable would be if everyone has the same rights in a democracy, like to vote and to be voted. Because if you set boundaries on who can be voted, you have to have someone to say who can be voted.
But there's no law now saying
not now, but
a person can't be elected if they lack a university degree, and yet almost none of them are.
Yeah, but that's a problem of who gets voted, and not in our society, but by setting boundaries and saying only educated people can be voted, that's a problem.
That's worse.
Yeah.
Gillian, I want to come back to you. Where's Gillian? Now, Gillian, stand up. Let's get him the microphone. Now, Gillian, you made the argument against the John Stuart Mill proposal that most people agreed with. And that was a broad argument in the name of what democracy means. And you said it was objectionable because it gave the well-educated, it made the well-educated in people into an elite group. And that elite status was passed down often one generation to the next. And being governed by a privileged, well-educated elite, you said, is not really democratic because everyone's voice should count equally. Doesn't that same argument condemn the current practice of representative democracy?
Oh, empirically speaking, yes. I mean, if you look at the...
What do you mean empirically? But morally, in terms of democratically, do you think it does?
I think it does, and it does not give people the feeling that you can actually achieve anything, right? There's this certain glass barrier that you cannot cross, and it's always like, there's always the same kind of people behind that glass, and you can never get there if you're not from that certain elite that in turn fosters the next elite, and so on and so forth.
Right. So you think they're objectionable on the same grounds?
Neither is just, yes.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone who's joined in this discussion. Thank you all for getting us going in a discussion about education and democracy. Let's give everyone who spoke a round of applause. Thank you, Simon. Now, what does this have to do with the subject with which we began, which is the danger facing democracy. For the following reason, I think, let me offer one possible connection, and then we'll have a discussion and see whether you agree or disagree. Let's look back at the last 4 or 5 decades. During this time, the divide between winners and so-called losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do, I think, with widening inequalities of income and wealth. But it's not only that. It has also to do with the changing attitudes towards success that have accompanied the widening inequalities. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit. And by implication, that those who struggle, those left behind, have no one to blame but themselves. This way of thinking about success, where does it come from? It arises from a seemingly attractive ideal. The meritocratic ideal that says, insofar as chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. Now, of course, chances are not truly equal in our societies. We know that. Children born to poor families tend to stay poor as adults. Those born to affluent and well-educated parents have a far greater chance of winning admission to universities and flourishing. Well, this suggests that maybe the solution to our problems is simply to live up to the meritocratic ideals we profess, to try to achieve a more perfectly equal opportunity for everyone. And surely, most principles of justice would say that equality of opportunity is an important principle. No one should be held back by poverty or prejudice. But suppose we were able somehow in our societies to achieve and to perfect true equality of opportunity, bringing everyone up to the same starting point for the race. Not only in terms of formal equality, but in terms of actual equality. Everyone not only starts at the same starting line, but everyone has the same access growing up to good running coaches and good nutrition and the best running shoes. And then we have the race. Then would we conclude that under those circumstances of true equality of opportunity, that the winners deserve their winnings? The principle of meritocracy says yes. But there's reason to wonder whether the principle of meritocracy is flawed, not just because we don't live up to it, but flawed in principle. And the reason it's flawed in principle is that even a perfectly realized meritocracy would be corrosive of the common good. It would be corrosive of the common good because of the attitudes towards success that it cultivates. It encourages hubris among the winners and demoralization, even humiliation, among those who don't win out. It encourages hubris among the winners because it leads them to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to forget their indebtedness to those who make their achievements possible. And it treats those who fall behind harshly because it passes a certain judgment on them. You had a chance, you fell behind, your failure is your fault. Now, how does this way of thinking about success help us make sense of the danger confronting democracy? In the following way. The meritocratic way of thinking about success is the moral companion. It's functioned as the moral companion to the neoliberal version of globalization that the mainstream parties have embraced over the past 5 decades. Max Weber noticed an interesting feature about the successful a century ago. He wrote, "The fortunate person is seldom satisfied with the fact of being fortunate. Beyond this, he needs to know that he has a right to his good fortune. He wants to be convinced that he deserves it, and above all, that he deserves it in comparison with others. He wishes to be allowed the belief that the less fortunate also merely experience their due." Now, Weber was reflecting on the religious conviction that success, worldly success, is a sign of God's favor. Remember, he was writing about the Protestant work ethic. And the conviction, the parallel conviction, that suffering is a punishment for sin. But a century later, proponents of neoliberal globalization saw market success as a vindication of merit in the same kind of way. And this happened because of the way that the mainstream parties who governed during these decades responded to the growing inequality that neoliberal globalization produced. Instead of contending with the structural sources of those inequalities, these political parties and politicians of the center-right and center-left combined offered a kind of aspirational encouragement and advice to people. They said everyone should be able to rise as far as their efforts and talent will take them. We heard this rhetoric across the political spectrum. And it has a certain egalitarian ring because it emphasizes the importance of removing barriers to achievement. Whatever your family background, or class, or race, or religion, or ethnicity, or gender, or sexual orientation, you too should be able to rise as far as your talents will take you. Now, who could disagree? But despite the seemingly egalitarian bent of this rhetoric of rising, it actually entrenched, rather than challenged, inequalities of income and wealth. It essentially offered those who lost out under these economic arrangements some bracing advice. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to university, they told us. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. This is the rhetoric of rising. Problem was, the elites who delivered this message failed to see the insult implicit in it. The insult was this: if you don't have a diploma, and if you're struggling in the new economy, your failure must be your fault. That's the implication. So it's no wonder that many working people, and remember, the majority in our societies do not have the university degrees that were valorized and promoted as the solution to inequality. It's no wonder that many working people turned against elites, meritocratic elites, professional elites, well-educated elites, and the politicians who spoke for them. elites during this period so valorized a university degree, both as an avenue for advancement and as the basis for social esteem, that they had difficulty understanding the hubris that a meritocracy can generate. And they missed the harsh judgment it imposes on those who haven't been to university. And yet those without a degree, those who saw job loss and wage stagnation for 4 to 5 decades, while the top 20% flourished, they noticed. They noticed not only the widening inequality of income and wealth, they also noticed and felt and experienced and chafed under the sense of being looked down upon by those with university degrees. And when we put this together with the fact that those who are governing, the presidents and the chancellors and the members of the Bundestag and of parliaments and of congresses, were overwhelmingly those who were flourishing in this system, who had the much valorized university degree, they were governing, they were enacting policies that left a great large swaths of the population behind. Now, this is a reflection in practice of the philosophical flaw in meritocracy that I spoke of a moment ago. And it found expression, this anger and resentment, as if a shock at least to elites, in 2016, when Britain voted to leave the European Union in the Brexit vote, and then a few months later, when Donald Trump won election in the United States. This was a backlash against not only neoliberal globalization and the economic inequality it produced, but also against the moral companion, the attitudes toward success that came along with it. And now, democracy is still in question, because it wasn't only Brexit and it wasn't only the election of Donald Trump, but we see the growing power and influence and public appeal of right-wing populist parties of protest who are addressing the grievances of those who've been left behind. Many of those grievances are entangled with ugly sentiments, xenophobia and racism and sexism. That's undeniable. But it's a mistake to focus only on those sources of populist appeal and to forget well, maybe this is a harsh term, but the complicity of the mainstream political parties, including progressive center-left parties, in creating the conditions that fueled the anger and resentment and grievances that have been as if dry tinder for the populist backlash that followed. So one question, Stefan, is whether people agree or disagree with that diagnosis. And I suppose a second question is whether, if it's plausible, what we might do about it. What the mainstream parties how they should reinvent themselves, reimagine their way of thinking about and talking about the economy and about social esteem, and whether it's possible to change the terms of public discourse in a way that shifts, that focuses less on arming people for meritocratic competition and focuses more on the dignity of work, which is to say focuses more on making life better for those who make valuable contributions to the economy and to the common good, but who in many cases, in the majority of cases, do not have the much valorized university degree. It's almost as if we've enacted, Stefan, a version of John Stuart Mill's proposal to let the well-educated govern, and we're now reaping the bitter fruits and the understandable resentment of those who don't enjoy that privilege. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Maybe I start with one or two questions,
Yeah.
and then we open up again. The thing. So that's not a symbol. So your explanation of the backlash of democracy and the rise of populism is very much based on an economic diagnosis, namely that the divide between the rich and poor became bigger and bigger, and with that there is also a divide in the esteem.
Yeah.
Right? And the first question is that necessarily so? I mean, I can see that, I can also see that a bit for the US, but isn't there also some people who might be even rich or at least not poor, but still they are looked down upon, namely, for example, because they don't have the right education, or because they come from different countries and different backgrounds, or because from different races and ethnicities. So is that so clear that the esteem economy really is dependent on the economic divide or on the economic development? Or aren't those two different explanations of the phenomenon?
The esteem economy is a good phrase, and I am very much trying to draw attention to the economy of esteem in parallel to the economic inequalities. And it is certainly true that the economy of esteem is fraught with inequalities that go beyond the inequalities of working people who lack university degrees and are looked down upon. It's certainly true that racism and xenophobia and prejudice against immigrants is a very damaging and corrosive aspect of the economy of esteem and of inequality, of the inequalities of esteem in our societies. There's no doubt about that. But as a matter, and morally speaking, it's to be condemned and to be opposed and to be rejected. As a matter of diagnosing what fuels the anger and resentment with regard to esteem of those who vote for right-wing populist parties, whether voters for Trump in the United States or Marine Le Pen in France or the AfD in Germany. It's not so much, those who support those parties tend not to be those from immigrant or minority communities who suffer inequalities of esteem due to racism. Relatively few of Trump's supporters, relatively few, were in that category. And I think it's probably the case also for the AfD. So the economy of esteem is a broad category, and there are multiple sources of inequalities, I agree. But as a matter of diagnosing the appeal, the grievances that are fueling the right-wing populist movements, I think it's largely white working class voters without a university degree who are powering the backlash.
This leads me actually to the next question, namely, don't we need a multifaceted account? So is it actually one explanation only? I mean, that you allude to it already. So maybe different components go together. So this is one important phenomenon, but just with the AfD, of course, one popular explanation of that right-wing populism in Germany is, of course, that they are mainly from former East Germany, and therefore feel degraded, feeling neglected, having not really fully integrated in unified Germany. So this is a special, so they are white, yes, they are often workers, yes, but there is another stigma to them according to their own self-perception. So that might be something. And the other thing is, of course, so there could be a cultural divide. I mean, the other two popular explanations is also there is a cultural divide, so you allude to that also in educated, non-educated, those who underwent the, so let's say the cultural revolution of the 60s, 80s, and so on, and therefore feel home in a cosmopolitan version of the world, which fits very well our economy, and those who don't. These might be just cultural things, not so much economic things. And there is, of course, the international explanation in a certain sense that people feel that Brussels or Washington, far away, is, or even international organizations are doing the political decisions, and even they might have a vote to the local parliament, but the local parliament itself doesn't really have the power to decide anything because it's decided on the global sphere, and therefore they feel that their political rights, as you explained in the beginning, they are not really taken seriously as one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. So this would be another explanation. And maybe these come, and maybe there are others, and maybe all of them needed to be taken together to give an explanation of this very broad category of populism that we face today.
Well, you've distinguished, and this is important, between cultural and economic factors in the appeal of authoritarian versions of populism. I think that there is more of a continuity and an interplay between economic and cultural aspects of these grievances than we sometimes are inclined to think. It's not as if there are some people who are unhappy about income inequality and stagnant wages and job losses. And then there are other people who are troubled by a sense of feeling disempowered or feeling that they don't share the cosmopolitan values of the well-educated professional classes who predominate in politics. But the sense of disempowerment, well, let's back up one step. What's at stake in getting the diagnosis right, it seems to me, is in figuring out what to do about it.
Agreed.
And in particular, figuring out what are the flaws, to go back to the liberal script, what are the flaws, the defects, the blind spots in the liberal script that have fueled, or so I claim, that have fueled this backlash. I think all of the elements that you and I, Stefan, have mentioned, a sense of disempowerment, a sense of alienation from a seemingly cosmopolitan attitude toward national borders that doesn't take national identity and belonging seriously, a sense of being looked down upon by professional classes who are well educated and who don't share the values of ordinary people, including values of patriotism and belonging. I think these all point us to defects in the liberal script. I don't see them as entirely separate. I think these are part of an orientation to the economy and to politics and to identities that flow from what we could call a liberal script. They're connected because the embrace of neoliberal globalization as an economic arrangement depends on leaving behind, this is how it was presented, the parochialism of national borders, and to allow the free flow of goods and people and capital across national borders, a kind of frictionless, fluid arrangement. This is what the neoliberal globalization project was about, breaking down the barriers and the obstacles to the free flow of people, goods, and capital across borders. Now, on one level, that's an economic program. And it's an economic program that serves the financial industry in particular and gathers support from the financial industry and companies that can outsource jobs to low-wage countries, cut their wage bills. So it's an economic project with winners and losers. But along with that economic project comes a certain set of, a certain kind of moral dispensation. Because if you want to persuade people to embrace the free flow of capital, let's say, to let big financial firms have their way, unconstrained by, say, local banking laws or financial currency restrictions, it helps to present this not as just a new financial policy. It helps to present this as if it's part of an openness to the world, an openness to difference, a cosmopolitan ethic that views national boundaries not just as obstacles to economic efficiency and capital markets, but that presents national borders as a kind of atavistic, nostalgic way of identifying ourselves that some people still cling to, but that we, who are sitting astride this new arrangement, are encouraging people to leave behind and rise above this, as if patriotism and national belonging and people's sense of tradition bound up with a particular place were a kind of parochialism. And you remember during the time in the heyday of the Washington consensus, neoliberal globalization, we were told again and again, the real division today is not between left and right, it's between open and closed. So that means if you're an opponent of the trade agreements that led to the outsourcing of jobs, or if you're an opponent of doing the bidding of Wall Street financial firms that want to be able to operate in China and other developing countries, if you're an opponent of those things, it's akin to a kind of bigotry to question those arrangements, because really this is part of the open world. So the point about cosmopolitan, which seems like a moral and cultural thing, and the sense of disempowerment, decisions being made in distant capitals in Brussels or in the WTO, beyond the reach of ordinary citizens, this is disempowering, but it's disempowering in a way that is bound up with this project, which is partly economic and partly cultural. That's why I think that if we're really interested in identifying the blindnesses of the liberal script, we need to see it as a whole in this way, as both an economic and a cultural project, and a moral and a political project. And I think it was flawed on each of these levels, flawed not only because it provoked backlash, but because much of what the people going for the backlash were bothered by were, at best, contestable assumptions and arrangements.
But may I ask one last question before I'm happy to open it to the general public, so if there are questions, think already about it, and then we'll get the mic to you. So the thing is, liberalism, of course, it depends very much how one defines it, and we don't want to go into the philosophical exercises of defining too much of the thing, but it's, of course, a question what one understands is, and if the basic idea is equal liberty, so liberty for all, but equal liberty. And this goes also to go hand in hand with the equal voting rights.
Okay.
So that yes. So if that is the basic understanding, then of course the national boundaries don't play a primary role. They might come on a second or third level, but it seems that equality, universal equality maybe, and equal liberty, maybe universal equal liberty, seems to be inscribed in a certain understanding of the liberal project. So, I mean, I know your position, so now I'm inviting you to say a bit how you think actually one can get the liberal script or the liberal order in congruence with some understanding of nationalism, patriotism, and so that doesn't look as old-fashioned and parochial, but in a way defendable even under liberal auspices.
Right. To pick up on your last point, Stefan, I do think that part of renewing and reinvigorating progressive politics will include, among other things, finding a language that addresses, well, let's say that addresses questions of membership and belonging, which it includes patriotism. I think progressives, and here this is a political point, not mainly for this purpose, a philosophical one. Politically, liberals and progressives make an enormous mistake by ceding to the right the resonant, potent language of membership, belonging, tradition, and patriotism, which is not to say that progressives should embrace the hypernationalism or the xenophobia of right-wing populist parties. To the contrary, instead they should recognize that when liberals fail to address people's hunger and longing to be connected to a particular place, community, with its traditions and its history, and leave that and even disparage that as a kind of parochialism associated with the closed rather than the open outlook to the world. When liberals do that, or when mainstream parties did that, they create a moral void, a vacuum that invariably will be filled by strident hypernationalism or religious fundamentalism. And that's what we've seen in societies that have evacuated of meaning the public sphere, which is why I have a long-running, I guess, friendly disagreement with those liberal political philosophers who insist on certain boundaries under the name of liberal public reason, whether the Rawlsian or the Habermasian version, the idea that citizens in pluralist societies, given our disagreement about the good and about virtue and about moral questions, should leave their substantive moral convictions outside when discussing constitutions or laws or rights, because we'll invariably disagree about those things, so we should seek principles of justice and right and law that are neutral with respect to the moral convictions citizens care about. And it's a very powerful position. It goes back in some ways to Kant, but Rawls and Habermas in modern formulations. And it's easy to see why this aspiration to neutrality in the public sphere has a great appeal. It seems to spare us the messy, contentious disputes that will invariably arise if people argue from the standpoint of their moral or even spiritual convictions in public, in the public sphere. But I think that we pay too heavy a price to try to exclude conceptions of the good from the public sphere. Philosophically, I don't think it's possible to define justice and rights without reference to competing conceptions of the good. That's the philosophical argument, and that's maybe for another day. But politically, which is our focus here, it's been very costly because it's evacuated the public sphere of moral content and left the way open to be filled by hypernationalism and religious fundamentalism. Sooner or later, that space will be filled, so progressives had better, and liberals had better figure out how to be a little bit more open to moral argument in the public sphere than the strictures of liberal public reason might allow. So that gives plenty of grist for people to resist and argue back.
So I see a first question there. So now, okay.
Thank you so much. I would like to inquire into meritocracy and also the feeling of superiority that it entails, and that is so toxic in a way.
Yeah.
So, in a desirable future society, to what degree is there actually any place for the feeling or the concept and the feeling of pride? Because as long as pride entails that I did something good happened to me, and I'm responsible for it because I made the right choices and it could have been different, then it is always toxic, because in reality these situations never exist, because you never can be sure if really something good happened to you because you made the right choice, or whatever that means, because you never have this transparency. So to what degree is it possible to save this notion of pride and this feeling? Because I think it's pretty important to many people, to human beings, that they have this resonance.
Right.
But to me, it feels like pride inherently has this poison in it, and it's very dangerous.
Right. Pride is a tricky thing for just the reasons. What's your name?
Jonas.
Jonas. For just the reasons, Jonas, that you described. Pride is a tricky thing because it can easily devolve into hubris. And yet there is a difference between hubris and legitimate pride. Hubris is the toxic strand in pride that you've rightly identified. And I think, so they're not easy to prize apart, but here's one possible attempt to distinguish them. Pride of a kind that presupposes that my success is my own doing, that I am self-made and self-sufficient. If I won the rewards fair and square. That kind of pride unavoidably slides into hubris, because it's a kind of false pride. It's false. No one, including the most successful, are self-made and self-sufficient. That image of human agency is flawed. It's deficient. And so the pride that flows from it is tainted and shades into and becomes hubris. What does that leave? What space does that leave for untainted pride? The kind of pride that arises from a different philosophical assumption about what counts as an achievement, about what counts as a contribution. Or maybe that's another way of putting it. It's a kind of pride that ties achievement to contribution. Contribution to what? Well, a contribution in the first instance, talking about work, to the economy. But why does that matter? Ultimately, it matters only insofar as that's a contribution to the common good. Pride in contributing, I think much of what animates the anger and resentment is that people have been denied or disparaged, denied their legitimate pride in contributing in valuable ways to the common good, and yet not being recognized for it. And one of the main culprits in that lack of recognition is our tendency to assume that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the economy and the common good. But that's a mistaken assumption. It's pervasive, it's tempting, it's widespread. But if it were true, then we would have to conclude that the social value of the contribution of a hedge fund manager is 1,000 times more valuable than the contribution of a teacher or a nurse. Or, well, do you think? Yes? Yeah. Let's get you the microphone. Go ahead. Well, wait. Say it again with the microphone.
Yes.
And tell us your name.
Actually, my name is Tamara. Good evening.
Yeah.
The system is rigged. The system is rigged for the people who are contributing for the greater good and who aren't paid accordingly. Because if you playing the big money around the world monopoly, you get so much bigger rewards that aren't in any shape or form relatable to a normal worker anymore.
Right.
And this is why I think democracies die on this conception.
Okay, but then at first I thought you were challenging what I was saying, but now it sounds like you're rising to my support.
Yes, I do, exactly.
Yes? Okay, so...
And I'm glad somebody in an institution is finally speaking out about it, because the whole political class isn't actually.
Well, yes. I mean, exactly. I couldn't have put it better myself. The problem is that if we agree at the level of principle that what a hedge fund manager contributes is not 1,000 times more valuable than that of a nurse or a teacher, then we've already agreed that the market's verdict on social value is flawed, is mistaken. It consists, and we know why, it consists of all sorts of contingencies, morally irrelevant contingencies having to do with supply and demand, and as well as monopoly power and all kinds of things that distort any possible true measure of social value. But if we agree about that, then that carries a demanding consequence for politics and public discourse. And you just said, and I agree, Tamara, that the politicians aren't really talking about this. Because what it suggests is that we as democratic citizens need to argue together and reason together and to decide what counts as a socially valuable contribution. And in the light of that debate, to configure the economy in the system of reward, economic reward and social esteem, in the light of our considered, reasoned view about what's truly valuable. And if that happened, hedge fund managers would make relatively less, and school teachers and nurses and care workers would make more and also enjoy greater social esteem. To put the point another way, we would need to reclaim, it's as if during these last 4 to 5 decades, we have outsourced our moral judgment about what counts as a valuable contribution to markets. But markets have been a highly flawed, misleading instrument for deciding what's socially valuable. Now, this is a hard debate to have. The one that I suggest follows from this. If we to reclaim from markets the judgments about what's socially valuable, because, back to Stefan's last question, to argue about what's a valuable contribution to the common good requires that we have or debate conceptions of the good. Because once we get onto terrains of how to value this or that social role, we have to have a view about what a good society looks like. Otherwise, how could we discriminate between trivial or unimportant contributions and the ones that matter most? So to have this conversation, to redeem from markets the question of social value and work and the dignity of work associated with it, we have to trespass on competing considerations of the good life, of the good society, of the common good, of the virtues associated with this or that role. So here's a good example, it seems to me, for my side in the debate I referred to with my esteemed liberal political philosophy colleagues who want to keep judgments about virtue and about the good outside of public discourse.
I have a question over there, and then I have one over there. Yeah. I'm not sure whether we can take it. Yeah, so yeah.
Thank you. Professor Sandel, I must preface my remarks by also, first of all, thanking you for giving us a sense of what makes you an exemplar as a teacher to begin with. I had two curiosities. One, of course, I was sort of wondering what the tipping point might be when slights begin to acquire real political force. I think you mentioned 2016 as a turning point, but I was wondering, as a political philosopher, how does one assess, in terms of the heuristics, a slight from a wound, from a serious gash, to a point where, it really is a permanent scar in some sense?
Yeah.
I was curious about that. And the second question I had was, I think, can anger have political value? I think it's taken a form which is rather unfortunate in terms of its right-wing appeal to base instincts, but can it also be a goad to more fundamental structural transformations? Thank you.
Well, my answer to the last question is I hope so. We'll have to see. It's an open question. My answer to the first question is how can we tell whether the injury democracies have had inflicted are surface wounds or potentially fatal injuries? It's very hard to know in advance. But I would say that the wound or the danger is serious enough to command our attention and to lead us to work together to rethink progressive politics, which, if my diagnosis is close to being right, also requires rethinking the liberal script.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I have one feedback and one question. I'd like to offer another argument regarding our previous topic of education out of the perspective of media. I'm not talking about internet or television, but the pen and paper right in front of you. Our education system largely relies on the training of the theoretical knowledge and the training of writing and reading skill, which is very important, but not the only channel we sense the world. But my basic sense is that our political current representation fails to really absorb different sense and feelings out of the language systems. That's my general argument. And my feedback is about your book. Today happens to be the 140th birthday of the John Keynes. I didn't know you noticed or not. And I
didn't. I'm glad you alerted us to that.
And his economic theory happens to be the cornerstone of the we call neoliberalism. But according to your narrative in maybe chapter 5, FDR personally is not very intrigued by John Keynes. And the New Deal and maybe even the entire American political economic policy shifted its track before and after 1937. Unintentionally and unwillingly. So to what extent do you think the, let's say, prominence of the neoliberalism economics attributed to his, let's say, the theoretical influence, or it's just out of the practical necessity? Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you for that. So let me just see if I've got it. So we're celebrating the birthday of John Maynard Keynes, the great economist. He certainly did play an important role in the 20th century in shaping economic thinking. But it's also true, as you point out from my book and the account, the historical part of the account, than when Franklin D. Roosevelt, who in retrospect we think of as a great enactor of Keynes's policies, when he met Keynes in the White House, after Keynes left, Roosevelt said to his advisors, he brought me this rigmarole of mathematical figures. He didn't much understand what Keynes was telling him, FDR. And FDR, he was not an economist, he was a politician in the best sense. And you're right, he enacted what we in retrospect describe as Keynesian economic policies that lifted the country eventually from the Depression. Not because he was persuaded by the economic theory of Keynes. In fact, the spending solution that FDR ultimately embraced that ended the Depression was not the result of domestic spending on public works programs and things like that, which were very small in relation to the whole economy. What lifted the country, the spending policy that lifted the United States from the Depression was spending on the war, on the Second World War. And in retrospect, this is seen as demonstrating the validity of Keynes's emphasis on macroeconomic demand. But you're right that this was not the result of the ideological conversion of FDR before the fact, which illustrates the sometimes rather loose connection between the ideas of academics, be they economists or philosophers, and what politicians ultimately do.
Yeah, I think we should kind of come to an end. Is that okay with you?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I have a fine, do I get to end with a final thought?
Why not?
Okay. First, I mean, this has been a very rich discussion, and we could go on all evening. And I want to thank you for that. We've spoken about the liberal script and about democracy's discontent and about the anger and frustration of many working people and how to account for it. We've spoken about the relation between economic and cultural factors in what we both described as the economy of esteem. And we agree that that's important. One of the most important shifts, and we haven't touched on this directly, that I think progressive politics needs to make, and that liberal politics needs to make, is not only to resist the market triumphalist faith that more or less captured liberal politics over the last 5 decades. That's important. But it's important also to see why it was that the market triumphalist faith, or the neoliberal version of globalization, was so debilitating for democracy and the project of self-government. And Stefan, you talked about a widespread sense of disempowerment, and that was a theme also of the first edition of the book. The deep connection between the sense of disempowerment that a great many people feel, and not only those who are voting for right-wing populist parties, and the neoliberal version of globalization, is that the market triumphalist faith, the neoliberalism, viewed the economy, viewed economic arrangements as if they were facts of nature beyond human control. This was the most fateful, corrosive, damaging toll that neoliberalism took on the democratic project, by viewing and presenting economic arrangements, the flow of people and goods and capital across borders. Now was an era of whether to be open or to be closed. And it was presented this way from the start. And it became an article of faith. It began with Margaret Thatcher, actually, who defended a kind of laissez-faire, unfettered free market capitalism, saying, in her famous slogan, "There is no alternative." You remember that? Mm-hmm. That by itself was not decisive. What was decisive is when the center-left political figures and parties who succeeded Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher accepted that basic view of the global economy. There is no alternative. And they put it in increasingly vivid ways. Bill Clinton put it this way. He said, "Globalization is not something we can hold off or turn off. It is the economic equivalent of a force of nature like wind or water." Tony Blair in Britain viewed globalization as being as unalterable as the seasons. "I hear people say," Blair said, "we have to stop and debate globalization. But you may as well debate whether autumn should follow summer." That was Tony Blair. And it was the faith of the time that the economy in the end is not subject to human control. It's like the weather. And for politics, it's really just to figure out how to adapt to the weather. But if politics is only about bowing to necessity, then it's not really a role for democratic citizens. It's a role for experts and technocrats to figure out how best, most efficiently, most productively to bow to the necessity of the economic forces that govern our lives. I think what is beginning to change, I certainly hope it's beginning to change, is that conviction. And I think not only the backlash, but also the pandemic called into question this idea about the inevitability of globalization. I would conclude with the following observation, really. An observation, but also a hope. Tony Blair mocked those who wanted to debate globalization. And his statement was smug at the time. But now, 3 decades later, it seems quaint. Climate change has reconfigured the seasons. Summer heat is arriving earlier and staying longer. Some scientists predict that absent changes in the way we live, by the end of the century, summer could last for half the year. So here's a good example of the shifting line between what's necessary and what's possible. What once seemed an unalterable fact of nature, the change of the seasons, has now become a subject for self-government, perhaps one of the most central questions of our time. The boundary of the necessary and the possible shifts beneath our feet. The civic aspiration to shape the forces that govern our lives now requires us to debate and to decide whether autumn should follow summer. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.